It's easy to trust God in the summer when everything is flourishing, but can you trust Him in the winter? Can you believe that even when you don't see anything happening, He's still working? Can you hold on when nothing makes sense, knowing that the season has to shift? Just like no winter lasts forever, no struggle is permanent. The same God who changes the seasons in nature is the same God who can shift the seasons in your life. Sometimes what feels like a setback is actually a setup for something greater. Life has a way of throwing unexpected challenges our way. Doors close, opportunities slip through our fingers, and we find ourselves facing situations we never saw coming. It's easy to get discouraged, to think, why is this happening to me? Why did I lose that job? Why did that relationship end? Why am I going through this struggle? But what if the very thing you see as a disappointment is actually a divine setup? In the moment, setbacks can feel unfair. You gave your best, but the promotion went to someone else. You invested years into a dream, but it fell apart. You prayed, you believed, but things didn't happen the way you expected. What you may not realize is that sometimes God allows things to fall apart so He can rebuild them better. The loss, the rejection, the delay, it's not meant to break you, it's meant to position you. Look at Joseph. He had a dream of greatness, but instead of stepping straight into his destiny, he was betrayed by his own brothers, thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, and wrongfully imprisoned. From the outside, it looked like his life was going in the opposite direction of the promise, but every setback was actually moving him closer to the palace. If he hadn't been in the pit, he wouldn't have been sold to Potiphar. If he hadn't been in Potiphar's house, he wouldn't have been falsely accused. If he hadn't been falsely accused, he wouldn't have been in prison. And if he hadn't been in prison, he wouldn't have met the man who would introduce him to Pharaoh. What looked like a series of misfortunes was actually a divine setup for his promotion. The same is true for you. What if the closed door is actually protecting you from something you can't see? What if the delay is setting you up for something bigger than what you had planned? Sometimes what we see as rejection is really redirection. We think we're being pushed backward, but in reality, we're being positioned for something greater. God sees the whole picture. He knows where He's taking you. What doesn't make sense now will make sense later. The pain, the disappointment, the unexpected detours, none of it is wasted. You may not understand it yet, but nothing is happening by accident. There's a purpose behind every challenge, a reason behind every delay, and a blessing on the other side of every struggle. Life moves in seasons. Just like nature has winter, spring, summer, and fall, our lives go through different phases. There are seasons of growth and prosperity where everything seems to be falling into place. Then there are seasons of struggle where nothing seems to work out, where you feel stuck waiting for a breakthrough that hasn't come yet. But the good news is this: no season lasts forever. When you're in the middle of a tough season, it's easy to feel like it will never end. You look around and all you see is hardship. The business isn't growing, the medical report isn't improving, the relationship is still broken. It feels like winter, cold, barren, lifeless. But just because it looks like nothing is happening doesn't mean that things aren't changing beneath the surface. Think about a tree in winter. It looks dead. The branches are bare, the ground is frozen, and from the outside it seems like there's no life. But deep in the soil, something is happening. The roots are growing stronger. The tree is gathering strength for what's coming next. And when the season shifts, suddenly buds start appearing, leaves begin to grow, and what looked lifeless comes back stronger than before. That's how life works. You may feel like you're in a winter season, but that doesn't mean you're forgotten. It doesn't mean your dreams are dead. Doesn't mean your story is over. Winter is not the end. It's preparation for what's next. Then comes spring. The warmth returns, the flowers bloom, and what once seemed barren comes back to life. Opportunities show up, the right doors open. The thing you've been waiting for suddenly shifts. You weren't forgotten, you were just being prepared. But the mistake we often make is getting discouraged in the winter season. We see the lack, we see the struggle, and we start believing that it's permanent. We let fear creep in, telling us this is how it's always going to be. I'm always going to struggle. I'm always going to be overlooked. But that's a lie. Seasons change. Fear has a way of whispering the worst case scenario. It tells you that things will never change, that you'll always be stuck, that you'll never recover. It magnifies obstacles, making them seem bigger than they are. It paralyzes you, keeping you from stepping into the life you were meant to live. But faith does the exact opposite. Faith looks at the same situation and says, it may look impossible, but I know that God is able. It may seem like there's no way out, but I serve a God who makes a way where there is no way. Fear focuses on the problem, but faith focuses on the promise. Fear looks at the size of the mountain and says it's too big. Faith looks at the same mountain and says, my God is bigger. When the Israelites stood before the Red Sea, fear told them, you're trapped. There's no way out. But faith said, God didn't bring us this far to leave us. He will make a way. And in that moment, the waters parted, and what looked like an impossible situation became a supernatural breakthrough. The truth is, fear will always try to talk you out of what God has for you. It will try to convince you that you're not qualified, that you're not strong enough, that you'll never overcome that addiction, never get out of debt, never meet the right person. But faith doesn't listen to the lies of fear. Faith believes that even when things don't look good in the natural, God is still working. Think about David standing before Goliath. The entire army of Israel was paralyzed with fear. They saw a giant who was bigger, stronger, and more experienced. But David saw something different. While everyone else focused on the size of Goliath, David focused on the size of his God. He didn't deny that the giant was real, but he refused to let fear dictate his actions. With nothing but a slingshot and a few stones, he ran toward the battle, not in fear, but in faith, knowing that God was on his side. Fear says, what if I fail? Faith says, what if I succeed? Fear says, what if it doesn't work out? Faith says, what if it works out even better than I imagined? The enemy wants you to focus on the obstacles, but God wants you to focus on His power. The moment you start believing that God is greater than whatever you're facing, fear begins to lose its grip. You can't let fear control your decisions. You can't let it keep you from stepping into new opportunities, pursuing your dreams, or believing for breakthroughs. Fear will try to keep you stuck, but faith will always push you forward. Faith doesn't mean you won't feel afraid. It means you won't let fear stop you. Faith is standing firm even when everything around you says, give up. It's choosing to trust in God's promises more than the enemy's threats. A breakthrough is when something suddenly shifts in your favor, when a wall that seems impossible to climb crumbles, when a door that has been closed for years finally opens. It's that moment when what you've been praying for, waiting for, believing for suddenly comes to pass. It's when the sickness turns around, when the financial struggle lifts, when the relationship is restored, when the opportunity you thought was lost comes back bigger and better than before. But here's the truth about breakthroughs. They often come right after the greatest resistance. The enemy fights the hardest when he knows you're close to stepping into something powerful. That's why before the breakthrough, you may feel like everything is coming against you. The pressure increases, the doubts get louder, the obstacles seem bigger. You start to wonder if anything will ever change. That's the moment when most people give up, right before their breakthrough. Look at the story of the Israelites at Jericho. God promised them victory, but before they could take the city, they had to march around its walls for 7 days. Every day they walked, but nothing changed. The walls didn't shake. There was no sign that anything was happening. They could have quit thinking, maybe this isn't working. Maybe we're wasting our time. But on the 7th day, after they marched one last time, after they gave a shout of faith, the walls suddenly collapsed. The breakthrough came not because they saw progress along the way, but because they kept going when nothing seemed to be happening. That's the power of perseverance. Breakthroughs don't always come gradually. They often come suddenly. One moment you're struggling, and the next everything shifts. One moment you're in the waiting season, and the next you're walking through the open door. But if you stop marching, if you stop believing, if you let discouragement talk you out of your faith, you might miss the very moment God had planned to turn things around. Joseph was in prison for years, forgotten and overlooked. But in one day, he was called before Pharaoh, given authority, and positioned as the second in command of Egypt. One day he was a prisoner, the next he was a ruler. That's the power of a sudden shift. You don't have to figure out how it will happen. You don't have to stress over when it will happen. God has already lined it up. What looks like a long season of waiting can shift in an instant, one touch of His favor, one divine moment, and what has been delayed, resisted, or denied will be released. The same God who turns situations around in Scripture is the same God working in your life today. Waiting is one of the hardest things to do, especially when you know that God has promised you something. You've prayed, you've believed, you've done everything you can, but nothing seems to be happening. The door is still closed, the opportunity still hasn't come, and the situation hasn't changed. It's easy to get discouraged, to think, maybe it's not meant to be, maybe I heard God wrong, maybe it's never going to happen. But just because it's delayed doesn't mean it's denied. God's timing is not always our timing. There are things He is working out behind the scenes, things He is aligning, things He is preparing, not just around you, but within you. Sometimes the delay is not about the promise, it's about the process. God is using the waiting season to strengthen your faith, to develop your character, to prepare you for the very thing you're asking for. If He gave it to you too soon, it wouldn't be a blessing, it would be a burden. Think about Abraham. God promised him that he would be the father of many nations. But year after year went by and nothing happened. He and his wife Sarah grew older, and in the natural it seemed impossible. But what God had spoken was still on schedule. Even though it looked like nothing was happening, God was working beneath the surface. And at the right time, not a moment too soon or too late, Sarah gave birth to Isaac. And the promise was fulfilled. Joseph had a dream that he would be in a position of influence, that he would lead and make a difference. But instead of stepping into that destiny immediately, he went through years of betrayal, slavery, and imprisonment. If you had looked at his situation, you might have thought, that dream will never come to pass. But the delay wasn't a denial, it was preparation. When the time was right, in one day, he was promoted from the prison to the palace. David was anointed to be king as a teenager, but he didn't take the throne immediately. He spent years tending sheep, fighting battles, and running for his life. He could have thought, God, you said I'd be king, but all I see is trouble. What he didn't realize was that every challenge, every battle, every season of waiting was preparing him for what was coming. When the time was right, he didn't have to force his way into his destiny. God positioned him. That's the power of perseverance. Breakthroughs don't always come gradually, they often come suddenly. One moment you're struggling, and the next everything shifts. One moment you're in the waiting season, and the next you're walking through the open door. But if you stop marching, if you stop believing, if you let discouragement talk you out of your faith, you might miss the very moment God had planned to turn things around. Think about Peter. He and the other disciples had been fishing all night, throwing their nets into the water, but they caught nothing. They were tired, frustrated, and ready to give up. But then Jesus told them, throw your nets on the other side. In the natural, it didn't make sense. They had already tried everything. But instead of giving in to doubt, they obeyed. And in that moment, they experienced a supernatural breakthrough. Their nets were so full of fish that they could barely pull them in. Sometimes your breakthrough is just on the other side of one more act of faith, one more prayer, one more step, one more declaration of God's promises. Just because you don't see it yet doesn't mean it's not coming. Just because the walls haven't fallen doesn't mean they're not about to. The opposition, the delays, the disappointments, they are all signs that you are on the verge of something big. The resistance is not a sign to quit. It's a sign that your breakthrough is near. One of the greatest challenges in life is trusting God when you can't see what He's doing. There are times when you pray, you believe, you do everything you know to do, but nothing seems to be changing. It feels like your prayers are bouncing off the ceiling, like heaven has gone silent. But just because you don't see anything happening doesn't mean that God isn't working. Behind the scenes, in ways you can't even imagine, God is orchestrating things in your favor. He's lining up the right people, moving the right pieces, preparing the right opportunities. The problem is we often judge our progress by what we see in the natural. If we don't see improvement, we assume nothing is happening. If we don't get the answer immediately, we assume God isn't listening. But God's ways are higher than our way. He works in realms we cannot see, arranging things long before they manifest in our lives. Think about a seed planted in the ground. For weeks, there's no visible change. If you judge by what you could see, you might think the seed was dead, that nothing was happening. But under the surface, something is taking place. The roots are growing, the foundation is being established, and then at just the right time, that seed breaks through the soil. What had been developing in secret suddenly becomes visible. That's how God works. You may feel like you're in a holding pattern, like you've been overlooked or forgotten. But God hasn't forgotten what He promised you. The delay is not a no, it's a not yet. If you could see what God is orchestrating, you wouldn't be discouraged. You would trust that His timing is always perfect. The longer the wait, the greater the blessing. When it happens, it's going to be bigger, better, and more fulfilling than you ever imagined. What you expect in life has a powerful influence on what you experience. Expectation is like a magnet. It attracts what you believe for. If you wake up expecting problems, difficulties, and disappointments, you're setting the tone for your day. But when you wake up expecting favor, expecting breakthroughs, expecting God to move, you open the door for the miraculous. Expectation is not just wishful thinking, it's a posture of faith. It's believing that something good is on the way, even when there's no evidence of it yet. It's looking at challenges and saying, this is not the end of my story. I know that God is working, and I am expecting a turnaround. When you live with expectation, you're positioning yourself for divine opportunities. In the Bible, there was a woman who had been sick for 12 years. She had gone to every doctor, spent all she had, but nothing improved. In the natural, she had every reason to give up. But then she heard that Jesus was coming. Something in her spirit stirred, and she thought, if I can just touch the hem of His garment, I will be healed. That was expectation. She didn't say, maybe it will work, maybe it won't. She believed so strongly that the moment she touched Him, she was instantly healed. Your level of expectation determines the level of breakthrough you receive. 2 blind men came to Jesus crying out for healing. Jesus asked them a simple question, do you believe I am able to do this? They said, yes, Lord. And Jesus responded, according to your faith, let it be done to you. Their healing was tied to their expectation. It's easy to lower your expectations when life doesn't go the way you planned. Disappointments, delays, and difficulties can cause you to stop believing for the best. You might think, I'll never get out of debt, I'll never meet the right person, I'll never see my health improve. But that mindset is keeping you from receiving what God has for you. You have to shake off the discouragement and start expecting again. Look at Peter. He and the other disciples had been fishing all night and caught nothing. They were experienced fishermen. They knew when to quit. But when Jesus told them to cast their nets one more time, Peter responded, "Lord, we've worked all night and caught nothing. But nevertheless, at your word, I will let down the nets." That was expectation. He didn't see any evidence that things would change, but he took a step of faith. The moment he obeyed, the nets were filled with so many fish that they began to break. God meets you at the level of your expectation. If you go through life thinking nothing good will happen, you'll miss the blessings He wants to pour out. But when you wake up saying, "God, I'm expecting your favor today. I'm expecting new opportunities. I'm expecting breakthroughs," that's when you'll start seeing things shift. Expectation releases God's power in your life, making room for the impossible to become possible. Too often, people allow their past to dictate their future. They've made mistakes, been through disappointments, or faced hardships, and now they feel stuck, convinced that their past has permanently limited their destiny. But where you've been, what you've done, or what has happened to you does not have the power to stop what God has planned for you. Your past may have been full of failures, but God is a God of new beginnings. He doesn't consult your past to determine your future. People may try to define you by your past, reminding you of your mistakes, your shortcomings, and the things you wish you could change. But God looks at you and sees your potential. He sees the person He created you to be, not the person you used to be. Moses was a fugitive. He had made mistakes, lost his confidence, and spent years hiding in the desert. In the natural, it looked like his best days were behind him. But God didn't leave him in the wilderness. He called him out, gave him a fresh assignment, and used him to lead an entire nation to freedom. Moses' past didn't stop God's purpose for his life. Rahab was labeled as a prostitute, someone others dismissed. But when the time came, she chose to align herself with God's plan, and because of that, not only was she spared, but she became part of the lineage of Jesus Christ. Her past didn't disqualify her. God used her as a key part of His divine plan. The enemy loves to remind you of where you've been, hoping you'll believe the lie that you've gone too far, that you've made too many mistakes, that you've missed your chance. But God specializes in rewriting stories. He takes broken pieces and turns them into something beautiful. He takes what was meant for harm and transforms it for good. Paul was once Saul, a man who persecuted believers, hunting them down and trying to destroy the church. If anyone was unqualified for ministry, it was him. But after an encounter with Jesus, everything changed. He didn't let his past define him. He didn't spend his life in regret. Instead, he stepped into his calling and became one of the most influential figures in history. Maybe you've made decisions you regret. Maybe you've been through things that have made you feel unworthy, ashamed, or unqualified. But your past does not determine your future. God does. He says, "Behold, I am doing a new thing." He is not holding your past against you. He is calling you forward into a new season, into a fresh start, into greater things than you've ever imagined. You don't have to stay stuck in guilt, shame, or disappointment. God's grace is bigger than your past. What matters is not where you've been, but where you're going. The moment you choose to believe that God's plans for you are still intact, that His mercy is greater than your mistakes, and that your best days are still ahead, you step into the fullness of what He has for you. No matter what battle you are facing today, no matter how big the challenge or how impossible the situation seems, you need to know this: victory is certain. It may not look like it right now. The odds may be stacked against you, the opposition may be fierce, and the road ahead may be unclear, but God has already declared the outcome in your favor. The struggles you face are not permanent. The difficulties are not the end of your story. God never promised that we wouldn't have battles, but He did promise that we would always overcome. He said, "No weapon formed against you will prosper." That doesn't mean the weapon won't be formed. It just means it won't succeed. The sickness, the financial stress, the broken relationship, the delay, none of it has the final say. David understood this when he faced Goliath. In the natural, he was outmatched. Goliath was bigger, stronger, and more experienced. But David didn't step onto that battlefield with fear. He stepped out with confidence, declaring the battle is the Lord's. He knew that victory wasn't based on his ability, but on God's power. And with one stone, one moment, Goliath fell. The enemy that looked undefeatable was taken down in an instant. Sometimes it looks like you're losing. It looks like the problem is getting worse, like nothing is changing. But you have to remember, God works behind the scenes. Just because you don't see progress doesn't mean He's not moving. Just because the situation seems unchanged doesn't mean the victory isn't already in motion. Think about the Israelites at the Red Sea. Pharaoh and his army were behind them, the sea was in front of them, and there was nowhere to go. In the natural, they were trapped. It looked like the enemy had won. But in that moment, God parted the waters, made a way where there was no way, and what was meant to destroy them became the very thing that secured their victory. Jesus proved this in the greatest way when He went to the cross. For 3 days, it looked like darkness had won, like the enemy had triumphed, like the story was over. But on the third day, everything changed. The stone was rolled away, the grave was empty, and death itself was defeated. The resurrection wasn't just His victory, it was ours. No matter what you're facing today, you are not fighting for victory, you are fighting from victory. The outcome has already been decided. God has already made a way. What looks like a setback is really a setup for something greater. The struggle may be real, but so is God's promise. And He has declared that you will win.